Coast to coast, border to border, and around the world, it's time for The Bill Alexander Show. The Bill Alexander Show is a guest-driven program where the topics are diverse and entertaining. Laugh and learn while you listen to one of the best hours of online radio. Now, here's your host, Bill Alexander.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Bill Alexander Show with yours truly, William Eric Alexander. All my friends call me Bill. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. This program is being recorded on November 10th, 2022, the day before Veterans Day 2022, which is really appropriate because my guest tonight has actually written a book called Of Courage, The Incredible True Story of Lieutenant Merle D. Green and the Green Hornets. On the phone right now, we have Justin R. Burke. Justin, how are you doing this evening?
Hey, doing very good. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad you could join me this evening because we've been talking now since sometime in August about having you on the program, but I think tonight's just the perfect night to be able to do it. Now, you wrote this book about your grandfather. What made it difficult is you never met your grandfather.
Yeah. He died in 1976, 6 years before I was born, and for me, he really kind of existed through family legend and the few stories that my mother and my uncles could tell me about him.
So the story is not just only about your grandfather, it's also about your grandmother too. Now, was she still alive when you were born, or did she pass away also?
She was alive, but she died in '83, so I was a year old.
Oh,
really
wow. Didn't
know her, but thought it was pretty special for her to at least have those memories with me, and I kind of hold those pictures that I have of her pretty dear.
So, since you didn't know your grandfather, didn't really know your grandmother, but you knew he was in World War II, what made you want to write this book about a person you've never met?
Well, I really had been like an aviation fanatic since I was little. I loved going to air shows and loved a lot of military stuff, and I wanted to be a pilot when I was little. And obviously, life's taken a step, tends to show you where you're going to go. But I wanted to do a little bit more research on the man, and my mother and my uncles really didn't have all the best experience with their father, my grandfather, when he was around.
Okay.
So I was kind of intrigued by him.
And where did you start? I mean, how did you even get the information if really no one actually had anything other than their day-to-day life with them?
Yeah, sure, and it shows in the book. I've been fortunate that my mother preserved a ton of their wartime correspondence, a lot of really amazing pictures, and obviously was able to have a relationship with their mom up until when she died in '83. But in addition, randomly in the early 1990s, my dad, for some reason, he was doing a lot of genealogy for our side of the family, but he wanted us to know about my mom's side.
Right.
He tracked down the 8th Air Force Historical Society, and we ended up contacting 4 of the surviving members of his crew and got amazing interviews that 25 years later I was able to incorporate in the book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So your grandfather was a young boy who was a long way from home. He was basically, the only flying he really had was with your great-grandfather in a crop duster, correct?
Yeah. So he was the crazy crop duster that people nowadays that I was able to interview with this still remember him doing crazy maneuvers and really devilry type of actions out there. So they had some really interesting stories of him.
So what made him? Was he drafted or did he join the military?
Well, so he knew his draft, so he enlisted in the fall of '42, and he knew in October that his draft time was going to come up.
Okay.
And he thought he wanted to get into the Air Corps before he would be put in like an Army position or whatever the government needed at that time. So he enlisted in September, right before. And in early 1942, the Army had just dropped its requirements for all of its air officers to have college education.
Oh.
He didn't have that at all. He was a farmer. And luckily, in January of '42 is when they dropped that. But in February, he came down with appendicitis, and it delayed until the fall.
So what training did he need? I mean, of course, I knew he flew with your great-grandfather, but was that enough training to get him started, or did he have to start from the beginning all over again?
Yeah, so a little bit of both. It's funny because the skills that he learned piloting over rural Illinois in the early 40s, late 30s, I think paid off during his wartime experiences. But when he enlisted, the Army Air Corps at the time didn't actually prefer to have their pilots had any sort of civilian flying experience because they wanted to train them their way.
Okay.
So he actually hit his flying experience on his enlistment records, and he spent the next almost 2 years going through 4 different flight schools.
What's interesting is thinking about it now, I can understand how his crop dusting could work in his favor, basically barnstorming like that in the military skies during World War II. I can see a comparison there.
Yeah, for sure. That was the age, especially back in the 1930s, where the barnstormers would come in and do that, just like you said. And it was pretty amazing because you'd have these World War I vets that were coming in trying to look for an occupation and putting on these amazing shows. So I think from early on, he was really inspired by that. And even Jimmy Doolittle, who would later turn out to command the 8th Air Force, did a lot of races around where he was in Springfield, Illinois. And I'm sure he was able to see that. So it's kind of ironic.
So before your father went in, did he know your grandmother, or did they meet afterwards, after he was enlisted?
So they knew, we don't exactly know exactly how they met, but, there's a lot of kind of rumors about that, but she was a Catholic from the city of Springfield, and he was a farmer from just outside in the rural area. And I think they had met through her doing some cheerleading and him playing basketball. And that's the rumor that we have. And then they got married very early on in 1942, about a month or two after he passed his kind of basic training.
Okay. So this whole idea of writing this book about your grandfather, was it mainly done for you and your family, or did you want to share the story with everybody?
It kind of started out originally as something that I was going to do, that I was hoping that my boys, my sons, could have up on their bookshelf, in decades to come. But it's funny because I was able to track down all of the other 9 families that were crew members on my grandfather's plane, and it kind of turned out to be this huge information sharing event where it was just absolutely amazing to be able to talk to these people about their relatives and the experiences they went through, and it turned out to be this giant project, and even allowed me to go over to Germany and meet some eyewitnesses over there. And it just kind of blew up from there. And I thought, it seems like a pretty interesting story. I think it seems like something Hollywood would almost come up with. So I thought I'd share it.
So is there any particular story that you've told in the book that sticks with you?
Yeah. So he lost his best friend was actually the bombardier on his aircraft, and he was killed on their initial mission as a total crew. It was my grandfather's 3rd mission, but he was killed, and he ended up dying while they were still over Germany. And when my grandfather finally made it back to the States in mid 45, he from then on he suffered with a lot of survivor's guilt and PTSD. Obviously kind of suffered with a lot of demons.
Right.
But I'm sure I couldn't imagine. But it was pretty amazing that the bombardier, his name is Jack, I found out that the Luftwaffe unit that had captured them when they crash landed buried Jack's body on the side of a road, kind of just almost threw him in a ditch and covered him with some dirt. Well, the local Germans, where they crashed from right next to the village, they didn't like that at all, so they retrieved the body and they buried it amongst their own in their own village cemetery. And he stayed there for about a year and a half. But the way that the Germans lended aid to the crew and took care of the body and did all these amazing things just really stands out, because you don't hear about that side about Germans,
right?
Kind of helping the Americans.
A few years ago, I interviewed someone who also wrote a book about his father during World War II, and he was also in Germany, and he was also a pilot, and he made a comment that there was that the German people did not really buy into what the Nazis were doing because they were against what Hitler was doing. So they felt it was their responsibility to take care of anybody that would be injured, died, or anything. So they would hide them from the Nazi army so they wouldn't actually harm them. And this just confirms it even more that these people were looking out for them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, amazing acts of bravery if you think about it, because those are all crimes against the state back
Right.
then. Those are very severe crimes. And to be able to have that type of courage, which kind of ties into the title of the book, ironically, I think is pretty commendable as well.
So what's really interesting is when you start telling the story, you started off about talking about your grandparents, and there's some photos that you have shared throughout. Where did you get the photos from?
Well, yeah, so I was lucky to have my mom preserve a lot of stuff because my grandmother kept a lot of the correspondence and photos during the war, and when she passed, she kind of passed that on to her, and I feel honored that it's come into my possession now, and I can take care of that as well. But funny enough, because my grandfather had all these problems and ended up after the war in the 60s kind of pretty much abandoning the family and
Okay.
disappearing. We didn't know about his brother or sister's family at all. We had no idea what happened to them or where they lived. Well, during this research that I did, I was able to connect with them, and they live 10 miles away from where my mother's at in Illinois.
Oh, wow.
And they dumped all this information. I got his pilot wings that I didn't know existed, a bunch of POW letters that he had, and additional family memorabilia and photos that are just absolutely priceless. So I was so fortunate.
There is a photo in the book that I saw, and I'm very familiar with the guys that invented it, which were the Wright brothers. And that is really a unique photo that was from what, around 1910, 1918, or somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty amazing. They were doing. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, finish.
No, I think that was kind of a really, really neat little episode to be able to include in that book. Because it flown near Mount Pulaski on the way from Chicago on down through Springfield and then into kind of southern Illinois, doing a plane versus train race. And they happened to land where my grandfather's father had grown up during that time, and he was there and able to see one of the Wright brothers come on in.
So when you start getting into the whole World War II, the Luftwaffe, and all that happening, and it's basically 1939. The German or the Nazis had one of the best flying corps in the world. Would you know how your grandfather felt because of getting involved something that was pretty much new at the time? I mean, it was being done, but it wasn't being done as a type of warcraft to be able to take people down.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of one of the amazing things that I still am surprised about, but I could not imagine being a 23-year-old rural farmer pilot who flew in an open seat biplane and enlisted, and within 2 years they're flying in the substratosphere in such extreme conditions that pretty much was an alien world like you're talking about at that time. And not only that, they're going up against the world's finest in the Luftwaffe, and I for all of those boys, and that's what they were pretty much all boys, is absolutely amazing, and some of the most amazing events and bravery I think in our history as Americans.
So whenever they were flying, and I don't know if you know this or not, but how many missions would they do a day? Would it be 1, 2, or as many that were needed?
Yeah, so the 8th Air Force at that time, my grandfather arrived in England in August of 44, and by that time they had raised the quota of doing at least 35 missions before they were allowed to go home.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Earlier in that year, in the spring, it was 25. It was 30, and then it was 25 really early in the spring. But they were getting so much turnover in the 8th Air Force and losing a lot of experienced veterans that they decided to expand that. And obviously, during that time, the Luftwaffe was starting to get beaten back. So they wanted to keep their men going, and they were putting up the biggest aerial armadas that ever existed at that time. But they would maybe go out on a mission for a day or two and then get a day's break. But sometimes they could do 3, 4, 5 in a row, but it would
Wow.
be at most a mission a day. And those are up to
Mm-hmm.
8, 9, 10, 12 hours.
So when you put the book together, you were mentioning letters that your mother was able to keep safe so they weren't ruined, and also you talked about your dad's sister and brother who had POW letters. Did you use those to reconstruct what he was doing over there?
Yeah. So I knew as I started writing this book, I probably knew maybe 50% of the timeline of my grandfather's life. And then once I came across these documents, I was probably able to reconstruct about 95% of where the man was every day for, almost 50 years. And it was really amazing to be able to fit those pieces in, and also at the same time kind of confirm my research as well. So it's pretty amazing.
So the other guys that were in the 8th Air Force that you talked to, how old were they when you were talking to them?
So let's see, we had the ball turret gunner, which I think was the youngest out of the crew. And when we talked to him in the 90s, he must have been, let's see, 70s at most.
Okay.
I'd say, right? Because 1921 is when my grandfather was born. Yeah.
And how was their memories, the recollections of what they remembered from that long ago?
Absolutely amazing, actually. And one of the things that shocked my father when he talked to them was how open they were about wanting to express these stories and get them out. And I'm sure after 3/4 of a decade, that must have been really tough for them to still kind of bring back up to light and talk about. But they provided some amazing stories, amazing details, and they were just absolutely amazing men to be able to talk to. And I remember that I was a young teenager, maybe not even a teenager, that when I spoke to the ball turret gunner. He was from Louisiana. I still remember his accent. But I remember thinking, oh, this is really cool to talk to somebody that knew my grandfather. And, he was on a B-17 and he was a ball turret gunner. But I didn't comprehend the opportunity that was going on at that moment. And I look back on it and I think there's so much more I wish I would have appreciated and talked and asked with that man, because it was absolutely amazing. So he's obviously gone now.
So dealing with being in the 90s when you talk to these men, how did you keep the information? Did you write it down? Did you record it? How did you keep track of this stuff?
Yeah, so when we did that initial research in the 90s, it was kind of all just a bunch of random scratches that were jotted down really all over the place. The information was just, I don't know, on a bunch of sheets and notebooks. And I happened to just keep them for another 20 years till 2018 when I started doing my own research. And what my father didn't have in the 90s was what I had in 2018 was just so much more advanced internet capabilities. And I tell you, being able to contact people in Germany and England and Louisiana, across the country, it paid so many dividends in my research. And I'd like to think the book is pretty interesting, but I guarantee it wouldn't be as interesting had we just written it in the 90s.
That's really interesting to me. So these individuals that you spoke to, did you actually get in touch with their families again, or are you just using the original research?
I actually got in touch with them again. I was none of the crew is alive anymore. They passed. I think the last one survived in like 2015. I think he passed. So I was talking to a lot of the sons, daughters, and nephews of the crew, and some of the stories that I had they had never heard about, and I hadn't heard about a bunch of stories, but it was, like I mentioned before, it was just such a great experience to be able to connect with people whose 9, 10 different families' lives crossed 3/4 of a decade before, and to be able to share those stories and talk about such amazing men was a great experience.
One thing I've learned over the years, because I've had my one grandfather was in the Marines during World War II, and he refused to talk about it. He told me that he lived it once, he didn't want to do it again. And then I had another one that was stateside during that. And then my father-in-law, who passed away in 2019 at the age of 96, was in the Navy. And it was so hard pulling the stories out of people, because a lot of these guys that saw action didn't want to remember it. Did you run into that problem with
Sure.
the ones you talked to?
Not the ones on the crew, but there are a lot of different individuals that were, either training captains that they interacted with in England. A lot of those kind of personnel that were very hesitant with it. But it was funny because of the 7 and 8 other families on my grandfather's crew that I was able to talk to. They seemed uh, very, very happy to share that information. Even before they knew I wanted to put together a book. So yeah, I was pretty fortunate.
There's a piece in here. It says, I saw forts and fighters blowing up, forts and fighters going down, smoking and burning, wings coming off, tails coming off, the sky full of parachutes. One guy floated into a low Fort B and was, let's see, my eyesight's getting worse is what the problem is. The print is so small, but it was just rolled over in the dive. The sky was all full of tracers, 20 millimeter cannon shells exploding, and even rockets. So this type of story that you have throughout the book, because individuals were able to give you the recounts of what they remembered. That had to be really amazing.
Yeah. I talked to a man named Morton Kimmel who flew in the same group with my grandfather at the same time. Lives back in Pennsylvania, and I was able to actually have a couple conversations with him back in 2019, I think it was. And the man is just absolutely amazing, spot on the ball, and shared such amazing stories. He was also a bombardier, and I remember one of the things we talked about was the Norden bomb site and how revolutionary that was, and it was secret high-tech technology back then, obviously, and there was a lot of effort put into protecting the Norden bomb site. So I asked him about that. Hey, what would you do if you got shot down? What did they train you to do as a bombardier? And he said he just took pause for a second. And he told me a couple well-placed bullets in the right spots would take care of that site. And he still wasn't willing to give me a lot of information, 60 years later on his technology. And it's funny because when that man and other bombardiers like him enlisted and went to bombardier school, they took an oath about protecting that technology. And
Oh,
they were
interesting.
unable to. Yeah. So even still 60, 70 years later, he was still doing that.
So when you look at this, there's a lot of photos in here you have of your grandparents and of some of the missions. Now, of course, I know these aren't the actual missions, but where did you get these photos from?
Yeah, luckily, I use a lot of National Archives and stuff off of Fold 3, but I was able to kind of actually make a lot of connections with people from the 94th Bomb Group Facebook forum, and they were instrumental in giving me a lot of details to fill in about that. They have some incredible researchers there and historians a part of that group, and I was able to connect with them, and it, I think, really filled in a lot of complementary information like that, and I was able to elaborate on some stories that I wouldn't otherwise have been able to had I not made contact with those people.
So the other thing is here is that the chapter 4 is among the elite, and it's September 1942, the U.S. Army Recruitment Center in Peoria, Illinois. And to the best of your knowledge, are you sound and well? Prodded the questionnaire that had been slid in front of Merle on the 7th of September, 1942. I'm thinking, I'm here. Of course I'm well. What do you want me to answer? But I think that's interesting that you were able to reconstruct that. Was that a letter he wrote back home? Or how did you get that information? Or did you just imagine what he would have said?
Somehow, miraculously, his enlistment record that I pulled that actually off of was kept in the family. So it was passed down and a part of all those records that my grandmother had initially started collecting. It's pretty funny, and we've got documents like that. We've got a lot of POW letters that he sent, and then also some awards and accolades that he was awarded. He got the Distinguished Flying Cross that was issued to him after on a mission at September 11th, and we have the narrative for that as well.
Oh, wow.
So it's really interesting. Yeah.
So there's something else in this. It says, but perhaps the most absurdly amusing and downright distressing assessment was: have you ever used cocaine, heroin, morphine, marijuana, or any habit-forming drug or narcotic since childhood, wet the bed while asleep, had gonorrhea, sores on penis, convulsions or fits, spells of unconsciousness, raised or spat up blood, had any illness, disease, or injury that required treatment in a hospital or asylum? I'm going, okay, that's an image right there that I can't get out of my head.
Yeah, right. Yeah, maybe for some people that's just an average Friday night. I don't know. But yeah, which was funny because they only allowed one line for that entire grouping of questions. So it's funny you answer yes. What are you answering yes to?
Yeah, exactly right. But again, you didn't have testing ability like you do today, that you wouldn't be able to give a blood or a urine test to see if they've used it. So I guess you had to take it on face value that they were being honest whenever they gave that answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in a lot of books that I've read about people enlisting and their experience enlisting, that people, young boys, want to get in there and get in the fight, and you'd be amazed how many were actually underage and lied about their age. I mean, what else did they lie about? But it's just kind of funny that the enthusiasm of youth does that, decreases the risk, I guess, for them to be wanting to do that.
The other thing that I think is amazing is the stuff that your grandmother did save, like the letter from the Western Union from September 18th, 1942, and keeping this stuff, because I don't think a lot of people would have thought about its significant value, that they would have probably had it for a few years and then was cleaning around the house, said, oh, we don't need this anymore, and getting rid of it. But this is an amazing piece of history. I mean, it's just like 4 or 5 lines long, but yet it gives you an idea of what was going on at that time.
Yeah, for sure. Western Union telegrams. I mean, in this case, inviting my grandmother to Nashville so they could get married. But yeah, I mean, think of the Western Union telegrams at that time that were used to inform families of MIA and KIA individuals as well. I mean, totally different. You think about it nowadays. But yeah, absolutely amazing documents of American history that are just, to me, priceless. I may be a little biased, but I just think they're amazing.
Well, what I think is interesting, and you made a comment about your boys having a copy of this to put on their shelves. How old are they?
Yeah, so I have a 14-year-old, a 11-year-old, and he's going to be 3 in December.
Okay.
So kind of spread out there.
So the 2 older ones, they've grown up in an age of technology. They've grown up with the internet and all this. Have they asked you questions about how information was passed? Because this right here, just with what you have from the family, is a time capsule of how people got their information from far away, from overseas, that it was not instantaneous. It would take periods of time to do. And do they understand the value of that?
I don't think quite yet. Just like I explained, being that teenagers in the 1990s and talking to this war veteran and not really appreciating fully what's going on. I think that just comes with as they get older, maybe they'll appreciate it a little bit more. But what they really find amazing is all the pictures and seeing these who are my great grandparents that are their age. We even have stuff from the early 1900s that they've still kept, original tintypes and pretty amazing stuff. So they love looking at that and looking at my grandfather's flight wings. He has a soldier's Bible that was kept in the family, and a flight log. So they like those little memorabilia, I think.
The other thing is just looking at the aircrafts and how they progressed over the years, and how they were very basic and crude back in the 1940s, and now they're stealth and they fly at the speed of light and whatever it may be, breaking the sound barrier. Yeah. But again, it's just amazing, and it wasn't really that long of a time. It was, when you started writing this or getting the information in the 90s, it was only about 50 years. So
right.
That really, just the advancements over a short period of time. Now, you made a comment earlier about your grandfather basically abandoning the family in the 1960s, and you mentioned the survivors guilt. Is there any idea why he actually did leave and not try to find help?
So from the research that I've done about that, I'm a firefighter, and to be open and honest with you, I've struggled with some PTSD and traumatic issues for some calls that I've been on over 11 years of being in the field. So I kind of empathize with my grandfather and the millions more that were affected by that. But unfortunately, while we can trace it all the way back to a lack of moral characters, what they called
Right.
people back in the Civil War that were having trouble, or shell shock, or combat fatigue. A lot of those resources for our veterans and actual diagnosis of PTSD didn't occur until the 1980s. It just didn't exist before then. So I feel bad for those veterans that were unable to get those resources. And not only that, you got to think of these 20-year-old boys, 30-year-old men that were coming back after the war, and the cultural stigma that they had to face about having trouble transitioning back into civilian life.
Yeah, that's just a sin on how we just ignored that, because it was supposed to be buck up, take it like a man, and move on. And yet we know
Right.
that during that period of time after they got back, the alcohol and drug use was higher because they were doing whatever they could to forget what they were dealing with, because no one, and I hate to use the term, but deprogrammed them from a war machine to someone acclimating back into civilian society. I mean, this was something totally different, and the U.S., I don't think, realized what they were dealing with at the time, because they never had this many people come back and go back into society as productive individuals.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny when you look at some of the statistics. It was saying in the 1950s was like a record high divorce rate for America. So I mean, you can obviously see, I mean, what's going on at that time. Look at the men transitioning, and it's before Korea's kind of happening. So it's
Right.
a really interesting effect that it has on our society.
Yeah, that really is, and you have a documented information of what's going on, and you can probably see throughout the book and throughout the information you have of what your grandfather was dealing with. That too bad someone didn't know about it when he did do what he did to help him get through it. Now you know more than you probably ever thought you would know.
Yeah, for sure. I think he died when he was 55, 56 years old, and like he was a young guy. That's so young. And the stories that we have, while he was given the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, he was a really great pilot, from what a lot of people say. The things that stand out about him, that the stories that were transferred on, were he came back from the war a shell of the young boy that left.
Right.
And he was on a mission. While he wasn't suicidal, he was on a mission to end his life somehow. So he was very reckless when he got back. He went back to flying airplanes, even though he had parts of his most of his fingers amputated on his right hand.
Ooh. Okay.
He went back to flying. He was in multiple aircraft accidents after the war. He raced mini cars. He raced race cars. Got in big accidents there. He was very reckless, speeding his boat around Lake Springfield, and got in an accident on Lake Springfield. Had a horrible car accident where he was stuck in the hospital for 3 or 4 months. And everybody that knew him knew that there was something going on with him, and he eventually kind of just disappeared.
That to me, that is just so sad, because like you said, he was trying to take his own life, and he was doing it in a way that I don't know if people realized what he was doing, or they just didn't know how to help him.
Right. Yeah, right. I think even nowadays, with all the resources that are available to us, like, how easy is it to feel overwhelmed when you're faced with a friend or a family member that's dealing with that? That's a huge stress for people to have to deal with. And then you rewind 50 years ago and see what they were dealing with. I'm sure they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do. So my grandfather turned to alcohol. He turned to nomadic tendencies and reckless behavior. And unfortunately, he didn't have any sort of support system that he wanted to use. and eventually made his way out to Las Vegas and passed there from pancreatic liver issues. So he kind of drank himself into a bad situation.
So you mentioned earlier that you had the opportunity to go to Germany to basically go through the sites that your grandfather was at. What was that experience like?
It's surreal. It still is. It's been I went in the end of August of this year, and I still think about it almost every day. And I think I cannot believe that I was there 77 years, almost to the day, when my grandfather suddenly dropped in on a bunch of Germans. You know, when they crash landed in
Right.
next to this village, and I was able to be greeted by the town mayor. I dedicated a plaque to the city for all the families on my grandfather's crew because they took care of them. They gave them aid. So we dedicated a plaque, had a ceremony there. The Germans invited us into the city hall, and we had bratwurst, and I can't really say, but we may or may not have had some beer while the mayor was on duty. But we were met with a local historical society, and they showed me all the sites. They showed me the crash site. And at the end of the day, they gave me the emergency crash axe that was actually on my grandfather's plane that a young boy had taken from the plane and kept all this time.
Oh, wow.
They awarded it back to me. So imagine how I snuck that through.
I'm
through
sure.
Boarding and customs. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure getting that in and out of customs must have been fun.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, when you went there, was there a language barrier, or did they mostly speak English per se that they could understand you enough?
Yeah. So, at various other locations in Germany where we were, going to Munich and Frankfurt and around a couple of other places, the English problem wasn't a problem at all. They were great. And I, being a very typical American, have very limited foreign skills, especially German skills. But where they had crashed is a place called Leiblos, and it's about 30 miles to the east of Frankfurt, kind of a small little village tucked in an absolutely beautiful area. And the mayor was able to speak a little bit of English, and one of the other guys from the historical society could. You could definitely feel there was that language barrier there, but after spending most of the day with them, it was funny because we were almost having these conversations without even knowing exactly what we were saying, but we could still know what we were
right.
communicating. It was really, really neat.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure you took plenty of pictures too to basically compare and contrast to probably what your grandfather had, just to see how things have changed.
Yeah, it was unreal to just do all this research for almost 4 years, 3.5 years, and even while I'd seen some pictures of these places in Germany, when you actually set foot there, you get this 360 completely immersive experience there, and it's funny how that kind of sinks in and impacts you and really burns. It really burnt a lot on my mind about what I was seeing, and it was absolutely incredible because for me. It might have been a very small piece of American history, but it was a huge history to me,
Right.
So it was incredible.
So when you got to speak to the guys in the 90s about this, was there a camaraderie among all of them because they did serve together in the 1940s?
So yeah, this is one of those questions that I've been kind of hesitant to answer. I knew it was coming eventually, but it's funny because so there were 10 people on the crew originally, and they all apparently loved my grandfather for his capabilities and leadership skills. And he's a very personable, down-to-earth guy, salt of the earth type of farmer, young guy. They all really enjoyed being around him. The co-pilot, however, I guess he wanted to really be a fighter pilot,
Okay.
and he was not happy with being number 2 on a bomber crew to this country bumpkin. So a lot of the crew didn't like the way that this co-pilot was disciplining and leading the crew. They didn't have any sort of confidence in his flight skills. But they got to push these guys off to war, so they didn't really have time to be able to fix that problem. And even after the war, there's a lot of stories that were told by that co-pilot's family that aren't actually as spot on as they should be, I think.
Okay.
So it's just funny. I understand things get interpreted differently, but talking to the family, there was a lot of animosity still between him and my grandfather.
Oh, interesting. There is a letter here where I guess your grandmother played middleman between the pilot and the gunner because of his feelings of shame, embarrassment with the accident. And it's a very interesting letter. It says, "Hello, Geg. It was good to hear from you, and that photo of you, we go for that. I'm counting on it to even keep that collector out. You should see you're propped up on the desk, you and the rest of the crew, and the B-17s. I'm sure our little ones will have wings somewhere. Speaking of little ones, and I will, the little green should be here in about the last of the month. Can you imagine Merle dashing around for diapers? Gag, I sure wish it were possible for you to visit us any chance, anytime will do. Why don't you hop something and come on up? Merle will take you buzzing in something. Gag, it would mean so much for him to see you and talk with you. Regards, Rose." So your grandmother was trying to reconnect with some of the guys that he was with?
Yeah, he was still struggling with a lot of guilt in transitioning back to civilian life, and she wrote another letter to Gegenheimer is his name, Jim Gegenheimer, amazing guy and an amazing family, and she wrote another letter saying that, we keep your picture propped up on the desk, but every time Merle looks at it, he breaks down and cries thinking about his boys, meaning his crew. But Rose, my grandfather pretty much shut down, and Rose decided to be proactive about it, and she was the one that lit the fire to try to get these guys back together. And while they didn't do it as a crew until I think the late 80s, that there were 4 or 5 of them that were still alive that showed up at an 8th Air Force veterans reunion. My grandfather was able to travel to Pennsylvania, down to Louisiana, and down throughout the South to reconnect with some of these families on an individual basis.
So, okay, so because I'm reading this letter again, and again, the way it was written the first time, you can see that it's a lot of stops and starts, and it says, "This is my first attempt of writing with my right hand. It's a little rough, but maybe you can make it out. Thanks for the picture. It is swell. I'll send you one of mine just as soon as they're ready. By the way, I recommended both you and George for the DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, for what you did then. We had our collision. I'm still in the Army Air Force, but home for now." And then it goes, "Gig, after writing this, Merle crumpled it up, threw it away, disgusted, but I think it's wonderful writing for his right hand. I've been carrying it around all this time, thought you might like it. I'm pretty proud of this being his first writing." So this was after the fingers were amputated off the hand?
Yeah, that was actually done after the war, I think in either late 45, or even maybe a little bit after that. But yeah, so he wrote that original letter and that narrative, and he got so embarrassed and disgusted by his sloppy writing. And I have this letter, and it's very faint, and it's very hard to read. But he tried to express himself on this letter and give it to Jim Gegenheimer, which at that time was a very good friend, and ended up being so disgusted with his inability to write properly that he threw it away. And Rose, always watching him, dug it out of the trash can and ended up mailing it back to him.
So how many letters like this are in the book?
Quite a few. I would say I had access to probably at least 50 letters between crew members and my grandmother and grandfather, and utilized as much as I could. I kind of tried to load that book up with as much important information as possible. But there's quite a bit that I was unable to just fit in the book. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm Scottish. I'm pretty long-winded, so I didn't want to bore people too bad, and had to confine it to about 350 pages.
So the book's been out since September 1st, correct?
Yes, correct.
So how is it doing? I mean, I know your mother bought a copy, but other than that, how's it selling?
Yeah. Well, I self-published it. It's on Amazon. It's on Kindle, and I'm getting ready to find somebody to do an Audible read for me. So I want to get that out. Sales are pretty. I feel so very fortunate to have the sales that I do.
Okay.
I didn't really ever expect to make any money off of it, but To be honest with you, I'm very self-critical, so I don't even look at the Amazon sales because I'm afraid to give myself an anxiety attack or something.
So, again, this has to be a big feat for you. Did you ever think you were an author, or was this just something you thought you'd try?
No, and I think by reading my book, you'll definitely tell that I'm not an English major or a professional author. But I read this book from Steve Snyder about his father, his experience as a pilot and in World War II, somewhat similar to my grandfather's, but an amazing story. And after reading that in December of 2018, I thought, hey, my grandfather's got a pretty amazing story too. I could do something like this. And I originally thought I was going to write an article for a magazine, but after doing all this research, it absolutely exploded into what it is now, and I'm very proud of it.
I had the opportunity to interview Steve when his book came out.
Yeah.
And it's and if anybody wants to hear that one again, and it is very similar to what you're saying, so they collaborate with each other. It's also available on my website, which again was a very interesting story because we never hear about the individual actually that lived through it. What we usually hear is this history dealing with everybody and not just one perspective. And I think we need to see more of the perspective through the individual eyes so we have an understanding of not only what they were dealing with, but what they were feeling as they were dealing with it.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the story and their actions speak for themselves. And I felt like that's kind of how I was with my story. I was more just planting things into a timeline, into a book, and just letting them speak.
Yeah. Because
what they did, what they said, what they saw is just absolutely amazing. You couldn't replicate it with the emotion and the bravery or the honor any better than what these guys themselves are saying. I'm a big fan of Steve Snyder's book. I was able to talk to him quite a few times because I was trying to get his input on this process of writing the book. And he's got some amazing videos out there. He's all over social media, and he does such amazing things. I really like the guy. He's truly an awesome guy.
Yeah, that again, your book and his book tie in together really nice. It really does, because it gives you that perspective of what was going on at the time, and both being fighter pilots, again, being able to do that. And some of the videos that he shared were some of the people he interviewed, which were fascinating, that he put up there. That's why I was kind of curious whenever you interviewed him in the 90s, if you guys did audio or video recording at the time.
Unfortunately, none of that, but I did come across some stuff like Jim Guggenheimer, who lived in Gretna, Louisiana, right across the river in New Orleans. The Gretna Historical Society did an interview with him. I think it must have been the late 90s. I didn't know about this, but his family sent that to me, and it's really, really an interesting interview to see this guy talk about his life growing up, his war experiences, and the problems that he faced afterwards. And it's actually a pretty emotional interview. And I think looking back at researching these guys, because I wanted to do them all justice if I was going to talk about them. I just didn't want them to be passing, characters or figures in the book.
Right.
I wanted to do them justice. And reading their stories, and I really felt this way about Jim Guggenheimer, is that man and what he went through could have been a book or movie in of itself. And he, unfortunately, I wish I could have wrote more about him.
Mm-hmm. Well, Justin, before I let you go, is there anything you want to tell my audience that we didn't touch on?
So I was hoping that if any of your listeners are interested, if they need help falling asleep at night or anything like that, or maybe they're interested by what we just talked about, if they're interested in writing me at the email at ofgoodcouragebook@gmail.com, I'd be happy to send out an ebook version to you if you're interested. My goal with all this was not to make any money off of this. I just want to get these guys' stories out there. So if you enjoy it and you change your mind, you want to buy a paperback or eventually Audible, that would be great. But I want to get this man's story out. And it's kind of my way of doing a little honor to my grandfather and those men.
Well, the other thing I think is necessary too, and I know a few history teachers that I'm going to share this with, that they can share with their classes, because I think it's important for students today to understand what was happening then. I mean, they can read what's in the history book, but they don't have an individual perspective of what was going on. And I think this is a very good start for them to be able to understand it. Your book and also Steve. So I think this is a great companion piece. So I will share that with them over the next few weeks so they can have an idea too. So Justin, I really appreciate talking to you tonight. This was really great, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it too. Again, give me that email address one more time.
Yeah, sure. It's ofgoodcouragebook@gmail.com.
And I will also put that in my description, so if anybody wants to get a copy of the ebook, they can contact you to be able to do it. Justin, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It is a great book, and it was enjoyable to read. And actually, it's a very easy read, too, which is really nice.
I hope so. Thank you so much for the kind words. It's been an honor.
Thank you very much. You have a great night.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Hey, a big thank you goes out to Justin Burke for joining me this evening as we talked about his new book, Of Good Courage, a book about his grandfather. And again, the name of the book is Of Good Courage, The Incredible True Story of Lieutenant Merle D. Green and the Green Hornets. I will put a link in the description for the email address if you want to get a free e-copy, and also the link to the Amazon page if you would like to buy a copy of the book. Guys, thank you very much for joining me this evening, and we'll talk to you next time here on The Bill Alexander Show.
Thank you for listening to The Bill Alexander Show. The Bill Alexander Show is a $1 Million Baby production. For more information, go to thebillalexandershow.com.